Good morning, everyone. My name is Mel Hartley, and I'm one of the team here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I would like to welcome you to this webinar on RTO governance. This webinar runs for an hour and a half, and we will be closing at 11:30 today. At this time, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. Now, I would like to introduce Claire Werner, who is our presenter for today. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Mel, and good morning, everyone. It's great to have you all with us this morning. I can see lots of really familiar names in the attendee list, so it's great to have you here. For those of you that I haven't met before, I'm looking forward to spending the next hour and a half with you where we are talking about RTO governance. So in our session today, we've got quite a few topics that we will talk about, spend a little bit of time discussing. And for once, we are not going to ask you to put your phones away. We are going to require you to use them through the session, so make sure you have that close by. And throughout that session, we are going to talk about really those key elements that exist for good governance, and we're going to explore what they mean in relation to operating as an RTO. So in particular, we'll look at the governance requirements and planning that exist for RTOs. We're going to look at the fit and proper persons requirements, and these have changed very recently. We will look at RTO records management. This is always one that when we spend time in RTOs, you have lots of records and bits of paper that you do need, and you also have lots that you don't need. And we are also going to talk at third-party arrangements, because they're a situation where there's often quite a bit of risk associated for the RTO. Now, while we're focusing on these things today, please remember that these are not the only things in which governance relates to, but they are the ones that we're going to focus on because they're areas where, from a regulator's perspective, we have lots of non-compliance in those areas. So we do have an hour and a half to talk about these things, and please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions at any time. Mel is here to help me with that, so she'll be monitoring the chat box and she'll bring to my attention any questions that you might be asking that we should be answering through the session. So, on the slide in front of you, you can see some logos from some companies, and I'll just pick a couple of these companies to tell you a little bit about them. So we might start at the top with Volkswagen. So Volkswagen had a really significant issue a few years ago when they committed fraud in the diesel motors pollution measurements. So basically what they did was they falsified emissions testing data in their vehicles, and that was later uncovered, and when it was uncovered, many levels of the organisation, management, executive structure knew about this fraud and endorsed it. And so what happened is Volkswagen in the US had a $2.8 billion fine, and that was just the fine. In Europe, they had a 16 billion euro rectification scheme that they had to go through on the vehicles that they had sold there. So from a monetary or financial perspective for the company, they're pretty big numbers that they had to deal with, but reputationally, their reputation was shredded. Vocation was an RTO here in Australia, and in 2016, that organisation, which included Phoenix, actually went into voluntary administration. When that happened, there were 15,000 students that were left without a course. There were 70 staff employed by that company that no longer had jobs. The ACCC investigated, and they alleged false and misleading behaviour and, their words, unconscionable conduct. while they were marketing and selling government courses under a study now, pay later type approach. So when you think about these companies, and some of them will, some of the other ones like Commonwealth Bank and the Insurance Royal Commission, things like that, all of these companies have experienced massive, massive failures of governance, and the results have been really quite catastrophic for them and catastrophic for the people that actually relied on those companies to do the right thing. So when we think about governance, there's a whole lot of words that might come to mind for you. On this slide, you'll see some words that might relate to governance, and you're going to see a code there for a program called Mentimeter. What we would like you to do is go to menti.com and type in that code, and when you do, you're going to see this slide, and what we want you to do is to select the words that you think mean or relate to governance. Okay, and as you can see, as you're starting to say yes, these words mean something, the numbers are changing on this screen, so we can see where you feel or what words you think relate to governance. Okay, so you can see there's a few of those words there that are coming up much more strongly than others. So things like integrity, accountability, compliance, transparency are showing up really, really strongly as they're words that you relate to governance. Some of the others are also quite strong in there. So you look at things like accurately and truthfully based financial information that you provide, efficiency, leadership, trust. They're all words that we might link with government. So when we think about good governance and you look at those words that you have chosen, those words are really about making sure that we manage our organisations well. And I'm really glad that the ones that you are picking are the ones that are coming up there. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a one-person organisation or a very, very large organisation. It doesn't matter whether we are talking about government organisations, not-for-profit organisations, private sector organisations. Every single organisation that we work with has an obligation to govern itself well. And governance tends to be intimately linked with regulation. So regulation are the rules that are generally made by a government body or some other kind of authority, so a regulator, for example, that are about controlling the way we do things, and that control is generally put in place to protect us as individuals or as a community. So in our case, in the vet sector, it's about protecting the students who come to us for the provision of training and assessment services. When we think about governance in that sense, it's about making sure that the organisation operates in a way that it meets its obligations. So the regulation is laying out all those protective control measures, and then governance is about making sure that we meet all of those obligations. So sometimes when we talk about governance, it's a bit of an abstract concept and it can be a little bit daunting to talk about it. But hopefully what we'll find today is that as we go through these things and look at how that's relevant to the vet sector, you'll have some really practical information and understanding about governance and how it might work for us to help us. So there's lots of known benefits for organisations that are governed well, and 5 of those are sitting on the screen in front of you. So typically when we have an organisation that is governed well, it increases the trust that we have in that organisation and their reputation in the sector in which they operate. When all the stakeholders feel that they can rely on the quality of what you're doing, in our case training and assessment, and they know that you deliver on what you say you're going to, this leads to increased levels of trust. The ongoing benefit of that, of course, is that you have stronger and more long-standing relationships with the people that use your organisation and the stakeholders in that organisation, including the students. Good governance can enhance sustainability, and the way that that happens is when you have these governance systems in place, they tend to identify and resolve any systemic issues really early because they're picked up early. Everyone's looking for them. And so what happens is you reduce the likelihood that you're going to have a costly impact from whatever it is that might be going wrong in your organisation. It's like a safeguard measure. It helps protect your reputation, and it can also protect the organisation financially and legally. Good governance tends to encourage positive behaviours, and this is about that accountability that was sitting on the slide that we had before. Having really clearly delineated policies and processes in a governing body or management committee or a management team who take an active interest and take responsibility for governance matters and how the organisation behaves really helps people to look to that and say, well, the right thing to do is to do the right thing, and they tend to do it because they know it will be picked up and they will be supported when they pick things up. Generally, it means that everyone in the organisation is working towards a common goal and they have a common understanding of what it is they're trying to achieve for the organisation. So what happens mostly is you get this high level of investment from the people working in the organisation for the outcomes of the organisation, and that's a really good thing to have. Often having good governance in place will minimise the risk and mismanagement that happens in an organisation. As you highlighted in the choosing of the words in the previous activity, strong governance really tends to increase the levels of transparency in an organisation and integrity within the RTO. And all of that actually creates an environment which is conducive to reducing risk. So risk isn't just a negative thing. When we look at risk, it's also about opportunities for the organisation because it's a planning process. So we can look to those positive things, maximise those opportunities, but we can also identify early risks for our organisation and manage those. And often you'll find that good governance can improve access to funding and other government programs. That's really about reputation, reduction of risk, and those funding bodies knowing that you are in fact a good organisation and feeling comfortable in allocating public funds to you to do what you need to do. So they are a few really common benefits of good governance, and my question to you is, when you think about the benefits of good governance, is there anything else that you would add to that list? And I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to pop your answers into the chat box. What are the other benefits of good governance for RTOs that you would add to our list? Yes, definitely improving the student journey. And that's, again, linked to the quality of training. We've got quality sitting there. Culture, yes. Staff empowerment, fabulous. Yes, definitely. Smoother operations, often efficiency and effectiveness, which links back to the quality comments. Definitely inclusivity and accessibility for students and staff. And we're often very focused on our students and we forget about the staff sometimes that sit in the organisations as well. So I'm glad you put that there, Amy. Thank you. Safety and wellbeing, yes. Okay. So we can see that there are lots and lots of benefits, and the reality is the list is endless, to having an organisation that is well governed. So when we think about our sector, about the vet sector, and think about the regulation that exists in our sector, we have at the moment a series of 8 standards, but every standard that we have in our current regulation has a series of outcomes, and there's some mandatory requirements that have to be met. Now, when those requirements are not met, all of those things have the ability to compromise the quality and outcomes for the learners. So when we think about the vet sector, our focus sits on those regulations, but of course there are a lot of other regulations that exist for different operators in our sector. Some things are for all of us, so things like privacy legislation, anti-discrimination, consumer protection, all of those things are things that we all have to take into account in our sector. There are also, depending upon what qualifications you deliver and assess in, there's other legislation that might be relevant to you. For example, if you deliver like forklift or cranes, and the high-risk legislation is relevant to you. If you deliver in the maritime area, AMS's regulations are relevant for you. If you deliver nursing, then APRA's regulations are relevant for you. So the RTO standards that we look at for governance in our RTOs are only one of many pieces of legislation or regulation that we need to take into account, and it's going to be a little bit different as we move from RTO to RTO. So we'll start with the common things, what our standards say about governance. So we primarily have 3 standards which are labelled as governance standards. They are Standard 5, which is about informing the learner and making sure that they are protected. Standard 7 is about the effective governance administration arrangements that exist in an RTO, and that's where the fit and proper persons requirements sit. And we have Standard 8 as well, which is also about making sure that you comply with relevant legislation and that you cooperate with the vet regulator. So obviously TAC sits there as one of the vet regulators, but we also have ASQA and the VRQA, who are also regulators in the vet sector. So while these standards are labelled as governance standards and the clauses within them, the reality is that all of our standards have some element of governance in them because it's about the systems that we set up to manage particular activities. Okay, so when we think about those standards, and you can start to see the spread of standards through here, then there are some key things that we think about. So before we even start as an RTO, we look at 2 things that sit within Standard 7. So the regulator looks at 2 things. That is the fit and proper persons requirements and the financial viability of the organisation. And so that sits as that barrier for every RTO or every organisation wanting to become an RTO, so you have to pass that hurdle. Once you become an RTO, then we start to look at the business processes that you put in place to manage the other aspects of what you might be doing. So things like decision making and oversight, how does that happen in an organisation? Who are the trainers and assessors that you're going to use? How are you going to market and promote your services to potential clients? When you enrol people, how do you do that? And when we start to think of vocation that we talked about earlier, that was the unconscionable conduct that the ACCC was talking about, those 2, marketing, promotion and enrolment. We have a look at how you manage the resource, equipment and facilities that you need to deliver what you have promised to students. We look at how that actually happens, the delivery and assessment. We look at your complaints and appeals process, and I've got an example related to that a little bit later. Certification within the sector, and of course the protection of the certification is incredibly important because that's the integrity of the sector. That certificate has to mean something. We look at third-party arrangements. That sits through many of our standards. And underpinning all of that, we have got records management sitting there, because the records management processes tend to tell us the story of everything that is happening above that. So when you think about what you need to manage in your RTO, these are all the kinds of things that you would be managing. So meeting all of those requirements are one of the risks that exist within an RTO. But I have a question for you, is when you think about your RTO and you think about the risks that you face operating in the vet sector, what are those risks? So I want you to use the chat box to answer that question. What risks do you face operating in the vet sector? Definitely financial risks, tough financial times for lots of organisations at the moment. Yep. Assessment documents, compliance, non-compliance in a whole range of aspects of what we do. Consistency across distances. Hello, Fleur. Nice to see you here. Staff resourcing. I don't think I've spoken to an RTO this year who hasn't said to me they have found it hard to get staff. Chantel, non-compliance of assessments. Yeah. Different interpretations of quality. Yes. That is a very, very interesting comment. And one of the things that was looked at with the development of our new regulation was having a more consistent interpretation of quality. Differences in interpretation, industry disparity, yes. So we've got assessment documents have come up twice there. And in fact, that's one of the highest areas of non-compliance in the sector, and it's our core business. So it's always interesting for me that that's an area where we continue to have problems with. Trainers maintaining their currency, that can be very hard. There are lots of industries where it is not easy for trainers to spend a lot of time in that industry, that there could be all kinds of privacy or competition type restraints that sit around that. Yes, an inadequate business plan. It's often one of the first questions I ask RTOs in audits is, what's your plan? What are you trying to achieve? And it's interesting how many people can't answer the question. Staffing issues again, so that's a couple of times that has come up there. So one thing is understanding the legislation, regulation that we operate in. And then the other thing that we combine that with is this list that you are creating down the side here. Regular changes in policies and red tape, yes. Physical risks, yes. Environment, facilities, equipment. I was actually just looking at an organisation yesterday where, they were operating in a remote area and we're getting them to show us the equipment on video, and the people who were showing us were saying, it's really hot out here, it's about 40 degrees and they're out in the sun showing us the equipment. So there's all kinds of risks that we have to manage. So when we think about our planning for meeting all of our legislative obligations, that planning has to happen in the context of the environment within which we work. And all yes, it was a significant risk, and it was something that changed the way we operate. And I don't think many of those things we won't change back, such as webinars instead of face-to-face. So all of these risks, these things that happen in a sector, and some of these will apply to all of us, and some of them will apply to only some of us, but these things also have to be taken into account in the planning that you do in your organisation. So as I mentioned earlier, risk is not just a negative thing. Sometimes these things provide opportunities for us as an organisation, and when we look at them and think about them, we should then be able to maximise the opportunity that they offer to our organisations. The flip side of that is these risks that you're identifying here. Then these risks are things that you also, if they're negative or have the potential for a negative impact on your organisation, they're things that we want you to manage so you can minimise or mitigate against the potential negative impacts of these risks. Generally, when we do that, what we find is that we have the organisation operating in a way that suits them, that suits the environment within which they operate, and our regulatory standards, the standards for RTOs, do actually want you to do that. They're structured in a way to help you do that. So ideally, we will look at our legislation, say what's relevant to us. We'll look at the risks in our environment, say what's relevant to us, and then we decide how we operate based on both of those things. Now, a number of you have mentioned staff in here, and staff is a really, really important thing. When we're ensuring good governance, one of the key things we have to do is we have to ensure that we have got the right people in the organisation to not only do the jobs but to make decisions about how the organisation operates. And that is one of the key things that sit with the regulator, this role of determining the fit and proper persons. So we have recently had these fit and proper persons requirements being strengthened, and Mel has popped the link into that into the chat box for the declaration that you fill out for TAG. This is part of Standard 7, and it's really about making sure that the right people are decision makers in your organisation. So there are some minimum requirements that have to be met, and a lot of those requirements are focused on things that have happened in the past. So they will look at past criminal convictions, financial records, decisions or disciplinary action that has been taken by either this regulator or other regulators. They will look at the business history, and they will look at the RTO history. And they look at all of that information to then make a decision and say, has this organisation got the right people in place to make good decisions for them? When we think about who the fit and proper persons requirements apply to, most of us can easily understand that the legally responsible person in the organisation, this applies to them. We have got the executive officer, that's the legal person, high managerial agent of the organisation, and then we have got any person who exercises a degree of control. Now, this is a really important point, because what we see here is this acknowledgement that it's not just the people who sit at the top of an organisation who can impact on how the organisation is running. So people who have control or influence have now been included in the fit and proper persons requirements. So this could be people who are owners, people who are part of a governing body in the organisation, and all of these people feed key information to the decision makers to either make the decision, or they are the implementers of the decisions that are made by governing bodies. And as a result, it makes sense really to say we need to check that these people are the right people to be doing that. So this information that Mel is showing you here sits in the declaration form that TAC has for you, and you can see all of that information when you access that form. Mel has popped the link in the chat box. So when you provide your completed declaration through to TAC, they're reviewed by your regulation officer or your case manager, and any concerns that they have with the information that's in that form are investigated, and they are then included in the briefing notes that go through to the council when the council makes a decision about your organisation. So fit and proper person is certainly something that we take into account. We take it very seriously, and you need to take it seriously as well. So when we think about all of that legislation, all of the risk that might be relevant to you, and we said you then need to make a decision about how you operate, taking all of those things into account. Those decisions about how you operate are the things that you then express in your policy and procedure documents. And so you can see there we've got a few statements around what a policy does and what a process does. But fundamentally, a policy is there to state your organisation's intent. It's a what statement. It says what we're going to do for you and why we're going to do that. Often policy documents are documents that are not only for the people within the organisation, but they're documents that are made publicly available as well, so that people, when they look to how they're going to, or whether they might interact with you as an RTO, know whether you're the right organisation for them. A process has a completely different purpose though. A process document is really to provide the how guidance to staff, so how to actually meet the promise that you have made in your policy document. So it's guidance for implementing a business activity. So it is often an inward-facing document rather than outward. When there is a process that does have an outward-facing aspect, and complaints is actually a really good example of that, then often what happens is that process is represented in a form that people fill out. And when you think about complaints forms or appeals forms, often the whole process doesn't sit along with it, but the key parts that are relevant for the person who is making the complaint or making the appeal, those things sit in the form for them. So it's in a much more digestible and usable format for the people who are going to be using them. So what these things do together is they actually are the management approach that is going to be used in the organisation. It's documented, it's our promise, and it's important that these documents are clear, that they're accurate, and that they are understandable and able to be used by your staff. And I said a little earlier I was going to tell you about a complaints process that I saw recently. So the process document for this complaints process said to the reviewer, so this was the direction to the reviewer, assess the evidence that has been provided and make a judgment about whether the complaint is substantiated. Full stop. So there was no other guidance provided about what they actually wanted the reviewer to do. For example, what evidence should or could be included, what processes should they use to assess the evidence that was provided for the complaint, what criteria would need to be met for the complaint to be substantiated. So for the reviewer, the process was not a useful document. When I asked a few people who had actually investigated complaints for this organisation how they did it and how they came to their decisions, they all said they looked at previous examples of reports and that's how they decided what they were going to do. So for that organisation, did they have a policy? Yes. Did they have a procedure? Yes. Was it useful? No. So when you think about your policies and procedures, you need to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do for your organisation. So for the policy statements, are they a clear statement of intent that everybody understands how they're supposed to behave and what they're supposed to do? for the process documents and provide useful guidance that is helpful for the people who are going to be using them. So for those of you who do know me, you know that I've been doing audits for TAC for upwards of 20 years now. And when we talk about policies, procedures, systems that exist in organisations, there's some real risk associated for the RTO at audit. And these are the most common things that we find in regards to policies and processes at audit. So they have systems, policies, processes that don't actually reflect how they operate at all. It's quite common to actually see a process and look for evidence of its implementation and to see a completely different process being implemented, and often the process that is being implemented is more effective than what's in the piece of paper they don't use. It's very common to see processes that are so vague that they simply restate the standards, so they don't tell the people who are using them how to do anything. And I've actually heard comments from RTOs where we've been told to make it vague, make it broad enough to drive a truck through, because then we can't get pinged at audit. Well, the reality is that's not a very helpful statement, and an audit is often more complicated because people do things in a whole range of different ways, and the RTO has no real way of assuring the quality of whatever outcome that process is related to. Sometimes the processes are really complicated and impossible to implement, and they're very constraining for the organisation. So acknowledge that there's a fine line between not enough information and too much information in them. And sometimes these processes are a complete mystery to the staff. So what tends to happen here is in audits, we will often have a look at your processes through a desktop type process first. And so I will have had access to the policy procedure manual, or I might have had access to your intranet where I can see all the processes that are there. And then when I go and talk to staff and I say, oh, but you're not using your such and such process, and they say, well, we don't have one. I'm like, actually you do. And here it is. So staff don't know how you want them to operate, how you want them to do their job in your RTO. So we need to make sure that whatever policy process we write and put in place for our organisation, that these minimise risk and maximise potential for us, they protect our reputation, and they ensure the quality of the training and assessment and the client services that we offer to our students. Now, we're not going to show you this video because it's 10 minutes long and we only have an hour and a half, but this is a really great video. It's called Got a Wicked Problem? First Tell Me How to Make Toast. And Tom, who is the presenter, discusses how to map out processes to actually help solve problems in organisations. It's a process that I use myself. It's a process that I've seen used in many, many organisations, and he uses many, many examples which show you how effective this process can actually be. So while, TAC's not saying this is the way to do it, it is one way to do it, and it's a very effective way to do it. There are many, many ways to plan your systems and processes, but we would encourage you to go and have a look at this video and take what is relevant for you from this video. And Bill has popped the link to the TED Talk in the chat box for you. So when we put policies and procedures in place, we do so with the very best information that we have at the time. None of us put policies and processes in place that we think aren't going to work. We put them in place because we think they're going to work for us. And often they do. They work exactly as planned and they achieve the outcome that we wanted them to achieve. But sometimes things don't go as planned as well. And there's lots and lots of reasons why that happens. But a really common one is often that the process itself is faulted, or the external requirements have actually changed and that process no longer works. And I guess what we're trying to get at here is that policies and processes, and in particular processes, are not set in stone. They are in fact a continually moving feast. They are things that change all the time and need to respond to what is happening in the environment within which you work. So when you have a look at this diagram, what you'll see is that in the top left, you've got these external requirements. And these external requirements are things like the needs of your customer group, regulatory requirements, environmental requirements. So one of the risks we had pop up, Elsa said pandemics. So our environment during the global pandemic changed dramatically. The way we then operated also needed to respond. So when we're scanning all of these external requirements and watching what happens there, they're the things that then help us define our management system, which is the way we're operating. So that includes our policies and procedures, our structures, our staffing, the resources that we use to actually do our business. So we put a system in place that's going to meet requirements, and then the next thing we need to do is make sure everyone knows how to do it. So we train people in the system requirements. People then implement for us, and what we find is that most organisations will have some measures of how well things are working for them. We call them all kinds of things. A very common thing is a key performance indicator or performance data or something like that. But they're evidence of the results. They're evidence that what we did worked or didn't work. And while we would love it to work every time, the reality is it doesn't. And often out of that process, there will be some learning and refinement that actually has to happen. But the end result of all of that is compliance and assuring the quality of what we do. So the other really important thing that this diagram shows us is compliance doesn't drive the way we operate. Compliance happens because of what we do as an organisation. So when, we will often have people give us a form and say, well, this is a compliant form. And, I'll say, actually, no, it's not, because it's not compliant until you use it well and it works to do what it's supposed to do. So compliance is an outcome of what we do. All throughout our implementation of our management system in our organisation, there are opportunities for learning. That applies to when things are working well, and it applies to when things aren't working well. When things aren't working well, obviously there's an imperative for change and for refinement to get it to the point where it does work. But when things are working well, there's also an opportunity to have a look at what's working well and figure out what you can spread to other parts of your organisation. Like, why is this working well here? Has it got anything unique about it? Can we take that, spread it and learn from it in other parts of our organisation? And of course, this is this word that we use all the time in our continuous improvement. So TAC has a fact sheet on continuous improvement, and Mel has just popped the link in the chat box for you to that fact sheet. We are, and I'm saying we, TAC, are continually looking at those fact sheets and refining them and improving them. So please make sure you pop over to our website, and I'm sure Mel will have the link for that too at the tip of her fingers, and have a look at the fact sheets that are there. There's a whole range of them. There's also a number of other resources there that are available for you to talk about lots of the things that we talk about in these longer workshops. So the reason that we have put the annual declaration of compliance there as a link is because every year TAC asks you to say whether your organisation is compliant or not. Now, what we don't want you to do is to say you're compliant when we know you're not. Because what happens then is, we've got this declaration that says compliant, and audit comes up for whatever reason and it's not compliant. And so we start to look at that and say, well, 2 months ago they told us they were compliant. How long has this been going on? 18 months. Okay. Do they have systems in place in this organisation that can actually detect when things start to go awry and respond to them? So saying you're compliant when you're not compromises trust with the regulator. It's far better for you to say, we're not compliant, this is the area that we're having a problem with, this is what our plan is to fix it, and this is the time scale that we are working to. Because then we have some confidence that your systems pick up when things are not working, that you have the capability within your organisation to actually put a reasonable response in place, and that you have capacity to actually implement the response that you're planning. So these things work together. As I said, it's a continually moving feast, and it's something that we expect to see happening in RTOs. Okay, so I've got some questions for you now. We're going to go back to Mentimeter, and we're asking you to think about your RTO in light of the things that we have talked about so far in our session. We've got 3 questions that we're going to ask you. So the Mentimeter code is there for you, and Mel has also popped the link in the chat box. And here's your first question about the governance arrangements that are in place in your RTO. So what we want you to do is to use this scale and say, we think we've got really good governance arrangements in our place, which you would put the scale towards the strongly agree, or maybe things need a bit of improvement, and you would move the scale towards the strongly disagree. So where does your RTO sit on this scale? And you'll see that that number changes as you are responding. Okay, vote is closed. So you can see by that on the whole we're over halfway. So we do think that there are some reasonably good governance arrangements in place in our RTOs, but we certainly have room for improvement there. So given that we're on the positive side of that, our next question to you then is, what is working well in your RTO? And as you type the word in, a word cloud will appear in front of us. Okay, so there is a lot of responses on there that are about continuous improvement. So it ranges from just saying continuous improvement is working well, to saying we've got a great schedule for the year, to we're monitoring what we do, having continuous review in place. So continuous improvement is very, very strong in there. We have also some information in there on compliance, engagement, staffing, resourcing. So in a lot of the responses that you have put in there, there are some very, very positive things in there, which is fabulous to see. We have one more question for you. What could be improved in your RTO? Okay, there's some very interesting responses in there, lots of it focused on staff And I want to make comment on a couple of the things that are there, like engaging trainers in compliance, adherence to compliance standards by every team member. In the previous responses, we had dedicated compliance team as one of the things that worked really well, and often it does. Having people in an organisation who are dedicated to looking at compliance and then can help other members of the staff in implementing. That dedicated compliance team can't do it by themselves, and what you have put on here in this slide in terms of engaging those other people in compliance or quality type activities is in fact incredibly important. Policy reviews, following procedures, again, digital accessibility. Sometimes it's very hard to find information in organisations. Development of staff, consistency across departments, new trainer onboarding is incredibly important. How do we expect them to do things our way if we don't show them what our way is and help them to do that? Yes. Development of staff, currency is in there, all things that, again, while we don't necessarily want to see what's not working well, in fact, this is a great list. And it's the kind of thing that we actually see in many, many RTOs, that these things do not work well. So it gives us a nice little snapshot to think about what we might be able to do in our RTOs. Okay, so we have about half an hour left, and in that half an hour we're going to focus on a couple of different areas within RTOs that are often problematic and linked very specifically to standards that we have, and that is records management and third-party arrangements. So records management is a really interesting one because there is no one way to actually deal with records management, and there is no one set of requirements that's applicable across every single RTO. When we think about records management, we have to first think about what a record is, and I forgot Mel wasn't changing the slides. What a record is, and then whether we might be keeping that record. So a record means a document or an object, so it's not necessarily a piece of paper. It can be in any form, including an electronic form, that is kept or has been kept for a particular reason. And that reason could be that the information that sits in that record is really important and we need to take information from that record, or it's connected to a particular event or a person or a circumstance. So in other words, a record has got useful information in it, and it generally has been used or will be used by the organisation in a decision-making capacity. So whether we keep the record or not is a decision that actually happens within every RTO once we go past those things that are legislated for us to keep. So when we look at the scale of records that might be kept in an organisation, if that's the scale, and this is probably how much is legislated, all of this bit is really about the decision of the RTO and how they operate. So when we talk about records in an RTO, we often talk about it as being a really paper-intense activity. We tend to keep lots of information. I would probably even call it data, not information. Some of it's useful, some of it's not, and often we don't have any real idea about why we might be keeping particular things. So as we talk about records going forward, we're making sure that our conversation around records management is focused on the usefulness of the documents that we are keeping. So Mel has popped the link to the records management fact sheet in the chat box for you there. And again, I would encourage you to grab a copy of that and have a look at it. So records management is a particular activity. And there's a few really important words in this slide, and they are the purple words. So it's about managing information in your organisation through its life cycle. And so it's important to acknowledge that a record being useful, that usefulness generally has a use-by date on it. And records management, therefore, is this really active, ongoing process in your organisation. Information is the focus of records management, not data. There's a subtle difference between those things. Data are like facts or details, and we derive information from it. We make inferences. So an example might be a student's test score. So if I've got a class of 30 students and I have got all their test scores, each one of those test scores is a data point. Information, however, is when I look at all of those test scores and I say, what's the median test score? Or I say, which questions are the students all getting wrong? Then I have got information because I can see patterns that have been derived from the data, and it's those patterns or information that I will then use to make a decision. So what we need to do is we need to understand this data that we collect, what information we're going to take from it, and what lifespan or life cycle does that information have for our organisation. And of course it's going to be different from organisation to organisation, and we have to manage that information in accordance with our answers to that question. So when we think about records management, there's some key questions that we should be asking ourselves. The first one, a bit of a no-brainer, what should I actually keep? You need to think about how long you need to keep it, and of course that life cycle concept comes into place there. How should I keep it, paper or electronically? So a lot of organisations now are scanning records, and when you're scanning records and storing, you need to think about how it is stored in relation to legislation, privacy. Where is that information stored? If you're using a cloud, where is the cloud? The physical servers that hold that data. Are they in a country that has data protection measures in place like we do here in Australia or not? Who's actually responsible for the record? Who owns it? When it gets to the point where it's going to be destroyed, how should it be destroyed? Is this something that has private information in it? And when you look at the data breaches that have been happening over the last few years and are showing up in the media now, and you think about how much private information organisations are holding for long, long periods of time when really those records should have been destroyed, it's a really important question. So who's actually going to destroy the record? And of course that links with who owns it, and how am I actually going to monitor that this system that I've put in place is actually working. So there are a lot of questions for you to think about, and your answers to them are actually going to be influenced by a few different things. Firstly is legislation. So obviously legislation is law, and there is law in place around management of personal data in organisations, but there is also a lot of legislation that sits out there around records that we keep. For example, our standards for RTOs are a piece of legislation, and they have information in them about records that we have to keep. We have regulation itself, so not just the vet regulator, but other regulators will have information on their or within their regulation about what records they need you to keep. Sometimes regulators will put out guidance notes that ask for particular things. ASK was a great example. In this, they have guidance notes around retaining assessment records for 6 months, retaining all of the assessment evidence. So that is in excess of what sits in the VAT regulation. So you will sometimes see that coming out from regulators. Funding bodies can have requirements for what records you have to keep. So, if you're getting publicly funded money, then we want you to keep this, this and this for this period of time. So they're going to tell you that. And of course, your own policies and procedures and requirements will also define what it is you're doing. So, for example, validation, post-assessment validation. If you are an RTO where you run short courses, so let's say, you might deliver first aid or you might deliver forklift, the course is short, happens within a week. So when you look at what you might keep over a year and you're looking for a sample that you can use for validation, keeping those records for 6 months or 12 months is probably quite reasonable. When you start to look at some of the longer courses, so like maybe some of the engineering courses or nursing, where the courses are 18 months long, sometimes 2 years, and you start to then look at what would we keep in that time frame and for how long, to keep something for 12 months doesn't seem reasonable, because you might need it 2 years down the track, 3 years down the track when you're doing validation. So your own RTO also has an influence there, and there's a definite hierarchy in this. You must do everything that's related to legislation, regulation. You must follow the guidance notes from your regulator or regulators. You have to follow your funding body requirements, otherwise you won't get your money. And then your own policies and procedures that sit on top of that. So when you can answer the previous slide's questions in this context, understanding what all of these requirements are, then you get an idea about what records you're going to need to keep. So here's just a few examples of each of those things to show you what they might look like. So this is in Schedule 5 of the Standards for RTOs, and this is about the registers that you keep as an RTO. And we have specific requirements in our legislation which tells us what we have to keep and how long we have to keep it for. And we're all familiar with those. Then you might have information that is put out by your regulator. Here's an example of our fact sheet where we talk about what our requirements are for records management. Here's another example of a regulator. This is AMSA, that's the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. They have some very specific requirements that sit around certificates of competency. So for people who are going to be, captains of a ship or captain of a vessel of a range of sizes, there are very specific requirements about what you have to do and what you have to keep. Here's an example that comes from a funding body, DTWD, that's our West Australian funding body. And in this case, it talks about retaining evidence of commencement and evidence of the final assessment in any unit of competency for which funding has been claimed for a period of 5 years after the end. So again, very specific requirements about what records you're going to be keeping. And then we have already mentioned your own policies and procedures, and that will look different in every organisation. So when you ask me the question in audit, what records do I have to keep, Claire, I'm going to say, this is how you figure out what you're going to keep. Each of us in each unique RTO is going to have to look at all of those requirements and figure out how to manage those records so that they are useful for your RTO, so you can make decisions with them. Okay, so third-party arrangements. Now, this is another area where when we look at third-party arrangements, they're incredibly valuable things to have for many RTOs. They do also introduce a level of risk in terms of the quality of the training and assessment or whatever service might be provided. So sometimes third-party arrangements are about training and assessment, but they're also often about a range of other services like marketing, recruitment. Sometimes it's about the use of facilities and resources. So there are all kinds of things that third-party arrangements contribute to vet outcomes. And our regulation at the moment is about making sure that you closely manage these types of arrangements because of the risks that they bring with them. So in clause 8.3 of our standards, there are some requirements for you to notify TAC when you have a third-party arrangement in place. And if you don't tell TAC that you have got a new third-party arrangement in place or that one has finished, that can actually result in non-compliance. Every third-party arrangement is subject to a written agreement. So that written agreement is between you as the RTO and the third-party organisation, and the written agreement is in place to set up governance arrangements for how that third-party arrangement will work. So that written agreement is about making sure that everyone knows what their responsibilities are, what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and when it comes to audit situations, that those third parties will also cooperate with TAC in an audit. And that doesn't matter whether it's TAC or ASCO or the VRQA. Third parties have to cooperate with the regulator. So let's think about what should be in our written agreements, and we're going to use Mentimeter again here. And given that this is about the governance of your third-party arrangement, what information would you actually include in a written agreement to make sure that the agreement was governed properly? Okay. So what you can see there, the words that have come out larger, so monitoring, delivery and assessment and roles are the most common responses that you put in. All of your responses are actually showing there. Yes. I'm going to come back to what you've just said there, Elsa, because it's really important. Okay. So all of those things are important to have in a written agreement. When we look at written agreements, often monitoring is a thing that is missing. It will say something generic like a monitoring agreement will be established between the two parties. That's not very useful. So in some of these things like monitoring and the roles and responsibilities, it's important that you actually lay out who's responsible for what. And of course, in our situation, we're looking at those roles and responsibilities against our obligations as an RTO, which is where Elsa's comment is really important to look at. We as the RTO are always responsible. The students in a third-party arrangement are our students. They're not the third-party organisation students. So sometimes when we look at these third-party arrangements, what it looks and feels like is that the third party is in control and we as an RTO are servicing them and providing a certificate. It's the exact opposite way around. We as the RTO are always responsible and accountable for everything that happens in a third-party arrangement, and we are hiring that third party to provide some RTO services on our behalf. So all of the things that you have put in that word cloud are really important. Those roles, the monitoring and the delivery and assessment are critical to be spelled out effectively in a third-party arrangement. Okay, So one is what the third party is actually going to be doing, but there are some other things that often need to sit in a third party arrangement as well, in that written agreement. So they're things like record keeping. Who's going to do the record keeping? How are the records going to be kept? How are they going to be transferred? How are they going to be accessed? So all of those questions that we had before also apply. If they're doing any advertising or marketing, how are we going to make sure that they comply with our standards? Providing data, and that can include our formal data reporting through to NCVER, cooperating with TAC, which we have mentioned before, making sure that learners are fully informed. And this is a very common one when there is an enterprise involved, where it's the employees of the enterprise, and so often it's a higher level person. It might be their training manager or their ops manager. So that person gets information about the training, but it doesn't feed down to the actual learners. Fees, how you deal with complaints, and how you're going to monitor. Support is another very common one that we might add to that list. So a written agreement for a third-party arrangement can take many, many different forms. There's no one set way that you can do this, but whatever form you take, then there is information that has to be in there. Make sure you focus on how your RTO is going to manage that agreement and what you're going to put in place to protect your RTO, because you do really need to do that. What you're going to do to protect your students and what you're going to do to protect the integrity and quality of the qualifications that are linked to this agreement. So in the tax fact sheet on third-party arrangements, which I'm sure Mel's going to pop in the chat box any minute, there's a whole list of information in there about what has to be included in a third-party arrangement, and then things that you might add to that. And there's the fact sheet there for you. When we put these third-party arrangements in place, often they get signed, they get put on a shelf, and they never see the light of day again until you get a change to them, until they get audited or they lapse. So one of the things you really need to make sure that you do is understand how you're going to monitor not just these things, but the agreement itself is doing what it's supposed to do. So that might include the procedures for how you're going to monitor this agreement, the time frames that you might put around that, how you're going to implement strategies for feedback between the two organisations, what are the kinds of response times that you might want to put in place. And, you know, for many organisations, they adopt an audit type process for their third-party arrangements. And that's certainly a useful process, but remember that it's not the only process for monitoring a third-party arrangement. Developing strong, respectful relationships between the parties in a third-party arrangement is an important thing to do, and it is often forgotten. So when we think about governance, this is probably a wrap-up statement. Every single one of us that works in our sector, in an RTO, in the bodies that sit around structurally in our sector, is responsible for good governance. And when we think about governance in our organisations, this is the message that needs to go for everyone. It's not just the people who have manager in their titles that are responsible. In putting our session together today, we've used a number of references, and these are all available for you as well. So obviously we've used the Standards for Registered Training Organisations for 2015 and the TAC Users Guide to those standards. We have used a number of fact sheets from TAC, their records management fact sheet, their third-party arrangement fact sheet, and the governance fact sheet. And we also have information available for you in the fit and the proper persons declaration. So while we have touched on lots of concepts today, it's when you go back to these other documents that you'll find some more detailed information that we hope you're able to use to think about how governance might be strengthened in your organisation, and as a consequence of that, the quality of the outcomes for our vet sector improved. Now, we would love your feedback. So there is a survey there that you can fill out to give us feedback about what you thought of today's session, and Mel has also put that link in the chat box for you. And above that in the slide, you can see that there are a number of sources there for information about how we operate in the sector. So we have a LinkedIn profile, we have a YouTube channel where we put lots of videos that are helpful for RTOs. We have our podcasts, the TAC Talk section there, which you can access, and we also have a newsletter that we put out where we keep you updated about things that are happening in our sector. So thank you so much for coming today, and we hope you have had useful information from today's session.